Hello everyone and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Ariana Jasmine and today we are going to react to a debate between Sagar and Crystal from the YouTube channel Breaking Points. Please make sure you like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this, and let's get into it.
This is a big electoral issue. So economy, number one, we've seen a lot of the polling, sometimes immigration. This is now immigration, at the very least, number two, genuinely number one for GOP voters. There's been some interesting shifts in coalitions. Let's put this up there on the screen. This was a new poll from the CBS YouGov America. This was conducted June 5 to June 7 and actually asked about mass deportation. So it says a majority of registered voters favor a, quote, new national program to deport all, quote, his words, undocumented immigrants currently living in the U.S. illegally, 62 to 38%. But the real shock, I guess, to the people here in the media is that even among Hispanics, a majority of them now favor mass deportation at 53 to 47. Let's go to the next part here, because this has been an interesting trend that in the last month or so has really began to materialize, where the share of Americans who say that they support mass deportation has basically exploded over the last 4 years. So you can see there that the top general public number is at 51%. This poll is from a month ago, just by the way. And then we look at it by race and ethnicity. It was 56% of whites, 45% of Latinos, and 40% of Black Americans. But if you look at political affiliation, you have 68% Republican, 46% Independent, 42% Democrat, and then generationally, there is a massive split. You have Boomers at 60, Gen X at 53, Millennials at 48, and then Gen Z at 35. So generationally, there is a big split. But Crystal, I think that this is really upturning a lot of the ways that we're watching kind of the media and everybody else grapple with this young and Hispanic move towards Trump, and specifically also amongst Black Americans. Immigration politics has been flipped over really on its head, where it's both that first of all, the migrant situation today is just so out of control that, to any previous situation, it kind of, I use the Marx term, heightened the contradictions in terms of people really kind of had to choose a side. But second and foremost, the identitarian view that you could just rely on Hispanics to vote for you because you were like pro DACA or whatever, that's gone. Those ages are totally gone. Trump obviously broke that in 2020. But I mean, to me, it's such a titanic shift in the way that people are even approaching the immigrant situation, the migrant situation, and then this blows identitarianism like out of the water. And I've seen Democratic elites responding to this, being like, what happened? And it's like, well, Trump happened, honestly. Rhetoric happened, policy happened. There's been a lot of stuff that's been happening.
Well, I think there's a lot of things that go into this. First of all, you're right to note that
Let's start off with the basics. We have to understand why we're in this position that we're in now. First of all, America has historically meddled in a lot of South American countries, therefore rendering a lot of their economies unstable. For example, in Haiti, Western forces, America, France, they all fucked with the Haiti government so much to the point where people are trying to mass exit Haiti. You look at the Dominican, you look at Mexico, you look at other South American countries. Yeah, a lot of people are trying to leave because of the economic state that their country is in. Somewhat because of America and Western countries, meddling. Some countries more than others. That's one point. Another point that someone also made in the chat too is that while global temperatures are rising, a lot of people are going to be migrating. Okay? A lot of these countries are going to be unbearable to live in. They don't have AC. They don't have, coolers, a cooling system. Many people, their crops are going to die. The economy is going to shift. They're going to have to move away and migrate away. And that is also another huge issue. And as inflation becomes worse and worse and worse across the globe, not just in America, but in other countries too, to the point where you can't survive, you will seek refuge in the country where at least if you make a couple dollars, you can send it back to your family and they can have food on their table. So when we're talking about, the migrant crisis is so bad, yes, it's bad, but how and why did we get to this point? Also, going beyond that, we don't have a solid pathway to citizenship within America. If we create solid pathways towards citizenship in America, America, we wouldn't be in this position. People would be able to apply to prove that they, are eligible for asylum, whatever the situation might be, and they can come to America, right? And also, third of all, America does have the opportunity to take in these immigrants. They just choose not to. For example, when a bunch of Ukrainian refugees were at the Mexico border, they opened up borders that were closed and they brought them in. They gave them a bunch of our government subsidies so that they could get on their feet and they can start living again. That same treatment was not given to the Mexican and or Latin American and or whatever country, were at the border also waiting to come in too. It was only given to Ukrainians at the Mexican border. So there's so many issues with this rhetoric, and whether many Americans in America want mass deportation or not, I don't know. I don't know if I trust that study, to be completely honest, because that study was obviously done by a for-profit marketing company. But regardless of that, we have to acknowledge, how did we get to this place in the first place? And it is because of American meddling, climate change, all of these different factors where we can bring in immigrants, but we just choose not to. We don't have a pathway to citizenship. I mean, DACA's anniversary was this Saturday, and we haven't even expanded on DACA. More than 30,000 their applications are frozen because they're not accepting. It's really hard to get into the program. They're not expanding it. They're not creating a pathway towards citizenship for dreamers, so they're on DACA. They can work legally, but how do they get that citizenship? Well, they might have to marry someone in America. So it's just overall, it's just a shit show. And I think we all have to acknowledge these things before we just make blanket statements,
Biggest divide is there is a race divide.
Yeah.
But the biggest divide is actually age, not race.
It's all age.
So you have older people who are, increasingly hardline on immigration, and younger people are still, in the same, more open and open to increased immigration as they were, say, 4 years ago, back when the whole Democratic Party was embracing that position in opposition to Trump. So I think, number one, you do have, just a reality of an increased number of migrants. Now, that has actually gone down over the past couple of months, but notwithstanding, there has been undoubtedly a large surge of migrants under the Joe Biden administration. So that's number one. You do have reality of, okay, there's a lot of people coming in. What are we going to do? Number two, you have an increasing sense of economic anxiety. That, if you look throughout history, often pairs with increased views, hardline views on immigration. So you've got that. But I also think really critical to this is the fact that, I mentioned before, Democrats under the Trump administration, they were very oppositional to the Trump immigration positioning. Now they're trying to position themselves as immigration hardliners, the overwhelming majority of, Democratic elites, starting with Joe Biden. And so you basically have both parties making a very similar argument about immigration. So I'd be curious to see, I would bet that the bulk of the movement in openness to policies such as this actually comes from Democrats, because you've got 42% of Democrats here in that Axios poll saying that they're open to quote unquote mass deportation. If that was coming under a Trump, no way, it would be totally different. So the political landscape there matters a lot. The other thing I want to say about this poll is I think it's important to understand the shifts in the electorate and how they're thinking about these things and where the issue stands, et cetera. I've done plenty of commentary before. You guys probably already know that I believe that Biden's immigration mistakes here are foolhardy, because for people for whom this is the number one issue, he's never going to outcompete Trump on this issue. He's going to continue to exacerbate his problems with young and progressive voters. I think that shows up in the polls here as well. So I think it's an electoral loser for him ultimately. But nevertheless, it's important to see this polling. But I also feel about this poll sort of the way that I feel about the polls before Trump was convicted, of people predicting how they would feel about a particular policy. Because it's one thing to, tell a pollster yeah, sure, let's do mass deportations. It's another thing when you have the reality of, listen, we're talking about some 12 million people, roughly.
Oh, it's
more
like 20 million.
You're not talking about, criminals or gang members or whatever caricature of an undocumented immigrant is. You're talking about people who've been here for 10 years, 20 years. You're talking about potentially 1 million children. You're talking about community members. You're talking about a huge cost. You're talking about, crazy scenes of, things that people under the Trump administration were sort of repulsed by. you're talking about also, if you're serious about this policy, which I don't think anyone is, including Trump, if you're serious about this policy, you're also talking about like economic suicide. A majority of
Absolutely. I think this is a very good point. And just like Birdie said in the chat, this is just not practical. It's simply not practical. It's just like the TikTok ban where they were like, oh, we're going to ban TikTok. Well, economically, that's economic suicide because so many people, so many small businesses now depend on TikTok. So many people use TikTok Shop. They get commissions from TikTok. They make TikToks. You know, an extra $800 from TikTok is food on the table for the whole entire month, right? So they want to ban TikTok. They want to take, deport all these immigrants back. These moves are all economic suicide. They're all economic suicide because I'm telling you right now, a lot of people who were born and raised in America are not willing to do the jobs that the immigrants do. And that's just fact. Like, I'm sorry, Nancy from fucking Palo Alto is not about to go and pick fruit off of a field or go work, labor intensive construction jobs. It's just not possible. A lot of the jobs that immigrants take up from any part of the world that they come in is labor intensive. It's tough. It's not easy. They're usually underpaid. They're treated like shit. So yeah, if you decide to get up and deport all these people, what are you going to do economically? Who is going to take those jobs? Because I know it's not going to be you or your family.
of farm workers in this country are undocumented immigrants. So, if you were worried about price hikes during the Biden administration, like that would be nothing compared to if you actually implemented this policy, which is why Trump didn't try to do this in his first administration. I don't think he's even dumb enough to do it in a second administration.
Okay, it's complicated. So first of all, unfortunately, I do agree with you. Americans don't have the stomach for mass deportation. It's not going to happen. I'm not the one saying that. You can ask the most hardline right-wingers, Jesse Kelly, Ryan Gerdusky, who's an immigration hawk. All of us have come to the terms with, no grandma on TV is going to be able to watch some kid get sent back, allegedly because they're with their parents. It's fine. It is what it is. America is what it is. That said, there's a lot that you can do. Mandatory e-verify, boom. People are not going to stay if they literally can't work. If you have mandatory e-verify, if you remove the public charge rule on welfare, people are going to do a lot of self-deportation. So that's really the policy that the Trump administration, as I understand it, Trump 2 would coalesce around. That's our Ryan talking about that this morning. So in general, about the politics and all of that, it's complicated because I would be stupid not to acknowledge what you just said. Let's put this up there on the screen. Joe Biden is really leaning into the dynamic that you're talking about. He's got a new policy he's announcing this morning, giving legal status to, quote, immigrant spouses of U.S. citizens. So, and this is the thorny part of allowing millions of people to live here who are illegal, is that now you have millions of people who are U.S. citizens who are then married to people who are illegal immigrants and whose children are U.S. citizens by birthright citizenship. So it's like, okay, well, now what the hell do you do? His new program would, quote, offer work permits, deportation protections, and open a path to apply for a green card in the future. This is basically like a DACA Plus style program. For those—
Good. This should have been a thing. Okay, I'm sorry. It's preposterous that a child that was born in America and has a citizen as a father or a mother who's a citizen has to deal with their father maybe getting deported or their mother maybe getting deported out of the U.S. Like, that's insanity. It's insane that we even have millions of people who are married to U.S. citizens and don't even have citizenship. Like, that is wild. That's such an insane concept to me.
Those who are think that this is a done deal, there's no way. It will be challenged in the court system, and it's going to be months and or years if any of this even makes it through. There'll be rules just like they had with DACA. But
this is my problem with Biden. This is one of my gripes with him. He makes these announcements, right? He'll say, oh, $20,000 of student loan debt forgiven for everyone. Let's go. Let's do this. And then the minute he tries to implement it, they challenge it in court and he almost always loses. And he tries to win through the court system every single time. And every single time he loses and he fails miserably. And it's just such a testament to the Biden administration because he does this countless of times where he'll do this thing where it's like monumental, it's crazy, and we're like, oh my god, yay, and then they challenge him in the circuit courts that is already fucking conservative, and then he loses. every single time. It's literally his MO. It's what he does.
More importantly, this is the dichotomy of the immigration conversation.
Yeah.
So in the previous times, whenever illegal immigration was relatively low, like the Bush administration, appetite for basically pathway to citizenship is much, much higher. These days, when you have some 6 to 8 million people who are here illegally just in the last 4 years, not to mention this like crushing migrant insanity across all of the cities, the conversation is all about enforcement, and the pathway conversation is low. Biden is trying to flip it, where he's trying to get some enforcement increase from what you were talking about, at the same time trying to tug on the heartstrings and say, well, what about these folks? Apparently that's everybody who's here illegally. Again, I don't think that any mass deportation program will ever happen. Both Congress will never fund it. That's part of the reason that Trump never did it. With the ICE force, and it's complicated. But basically, the way that it works right now is that unless you're like a convicted felon, you're not getting deported. You're basically just left alone. So there's a level of enforcement prioritization, or whatever it's called. I do think it's interesting. Now, I had been looking for some possible counter evidence to some of the stuff you've been talking about European parties. There's one counter example, which is interesting. This is Washington Post has this written up, but it's a common dynamic. How progressive Denmark became the face of the anti-migration left, where basically Denmark is one of the only neoliberal left parties that remains in existence in power in Europe, well popularly elected, and it has one of the most hardline immigration stances that exists, including telling like Muslim kids like you're not allowed to pray the Quran in school or whatever, like some crazy stuff that would never even fly here in the U.S. But what I'm saying is that in Denmark, what they successfully, at least, were able to do is the so-called left basically paired off a lot of the anti-immigration voters, but they did it 5-10 years ago, so they have some credibility on the issue, and they've been able to be reelected. At this point, though, I think that effectively a lot of the policy stuff is irreconcilable, and so the immigration voter is probably going to vote for Donald Trump just because they don't have any other choice.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, they do have another. I mean, Biden is clearly, in some ways, there's like a Nixon goes to China phenomena, or like a Bill Clinton. You know, the Democrat is the one who kills welfare. If the Democrats actually, you know, were appropriated the money and were very hardly immigrant, I actually think they could get away with a lot more than Trump could, because you see that in the polling number. Like again, now you have 42% of Democrats saying, sure, deport all 12 million undocumented immigrants, which again, like if you take that policy seriously, it's actually insane. The level of surveillance, intrusion, deep state infiltration that would require the mass detention centers, arresting grandmas, like you said, kids, deporting, the cost in and of itself would be insane. You know, it would not fly, okay, that actual policy. But that just shows you that when you have the Democratic Party and they're just like following the leader, well, they say this is fine, so we'll go along with it. It actually creates more political space. But, you know, to your point, like I think it is very clear Biden's moves with regard to immigration are not going to solve his issue with immigration hardliners, because those people are just Republicans at this point, and not just on immigration, right? There's a whole host of issues on which they likely disagree with Joe Biden. So on the political front, you know, I did want to mention with regard to this executive order, because you do have a real, you know, people have complicated feelings about this issue. So on the one hand, there is a new, at least theoretical embrace that, again, I think if it was implemented would completely flip, but theoretical embrace of more hardline positions. But you also had, the last poll had 74% of people saying they support a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants who've been in the country for a lot of years and passed a background check. So I have no expectation that this executive order is going to provoke a backlash outside of...
I think that's such an important point, because I do think that the average American does believe in pathway to citizenship. I really do. Because if you were, for example, brought here when you were 2, you don't even speak your native language, you went to school, you got your law degree or you got whatever degree, you're working within the American economy, you're paying your taxes, you have, for the most part, stayed out of trouble within the law, it's actually more expensive and more time consuming to deport you than to just allow you to live in America and contribute to the economy. That's just a fact, right? Now, if you're like a convicted felon, or if you keep getting in trouble, or if you're genuinely causing issues, that's a different story. But for the majority of immigrants, especially the ones on DACA, they pay their taxes, they pay their dues, they work very well-respected jobs. Most of them are highly educated, college, university educated. And so saying like, okay, let's mass deport all these people and putting them all in like one bucket of, oh, you're undocumented, therefore you gotta go, it's just not fair. And I think a lot of people are very sensible to that fact. Like, they do understand that, okay, well, there's a difference between different people who are undocumented immigrants. You know what I mean?
Of, people who are just, hardline already on immigration. I think if you pull this specific executive order, which, by the way, if it did go into effect and makes it through the courts and all of those things, very much up in the air. Sagar's right. It'll take months for this all to be adjudicated. It's going to be called into question, et cetera.
And yeah, not only is it like highly vetted just to become an American immigrant when you come to America, it's also very expensive. I know people who are married to undocumented people, and they went to lawyers to try to get their spouses documented, and the lawyers quoted them tens and thousands of dollars. People can't afford that. You can't afford to pay an immigration attorney $20,000 just to give your wife papers within 10 years, right? Like, you'd rather just, I don't know, figure it out than have to shell that kind of money, especially if you just don't have that kind of money. You're an immigrant, So the whole entire system is just fucking rigged. But I do think most people understand that it is rigged,
The Biden administration thinks that they have a good legal argument. I don't really know. We'll see. But the estimate I saw is this would apply to some 1.3 million people. So it's not nothing. Like, this would be a significant number of people who would be getting work permits and a pathway to citizenship. And based on the polling that I'm seeing, you would have a pretty large majority support for such a program, just as you had very significant large support for the DACA program. The other questions they asked, this is a Wall Street Journal poll from like 2 months ago. 66% of voters support creating a mechanism for immigrants brought into the country illegally as children, often called dreamers, to gain citizenship. 58%, according to this poll, back actually increasing the level of legal immigration to the U.S. So the polling on this and the political dynamics on it is far from straightforward, I would say.
Absolutely. And look, I mean, nobody's saying that anybody supports like shutting things down. I'm not naive. Like I just said, mass deportation, it's not going to happen. I know what this country looks like. I know how television works, how the media works.
But it's not just that. It's also, the morality, listen, to me, the morality part is very important. But I also think even Donald Trump would realize, like, economically, it would be such a disaster. Half of farm workers just, that's it, no more, crops rotting in the field. If you think prices were high recently, like, it would be nothing compared to that.
I just hate this argument.
You'd have supply chain issues. You'd have meat processing plants.
Here we go. Sagar is about to be on his shit again. Watch.
Shut down. You'd have, construction, like housing costs are already astronomical. You've got some 20% of the construction industry that's undocumented immigrants, cooks, restaurants, food prep. I mean, just the widespread economic chaos would be political and economic suicide for the country.
But I would put it this way. It's bad for American GDP to go into a trade war with China. I still support it. I fully admit and believe that it is bad for top-line GDP. I think it's bad for a lot of businesses. I don't care. I think it's the right thing to do. Same thing here. It's like, so our broken system employs a bunch of people who are here illegally and who are unskilled. It's like, yeah, deportation or forcing them to leave through self-deportation matters through E-Verify. Will there be a higher cost? Yes, true. Will wages go up? Yeah, I do believe that. I mean, will it be bad for Tyson Food meat processing? Will Costco rotisserie chicken stay at $5?
It wouldn't just be bad for Tyson Food.
You know what really pisses me the fuck off? I'm about to go off. So Republicans constantly want to bitch and moan about inflation, right? And I agree, inflation is a bitch. Like, yeah, we're all struggling under inflation. I'm probably never going to be able to afford to buy a house on my own. Groceries are expensive. Going out is expensive. One cocktail is $15. Okay, we all agree on that, right? Okay, guess what, genius? If you deport all of these non-problematic, undocumented immigrants that are just coming here to make a living wage to send it back to their families, we are going to be paying triple the amount that we're paying right now for our produce, for our meat, for basic necessities that we need, okay? Not to mention the construction, the crops, the meat factories, the restaurants. They're not going to have any more employees because many Americans are not willing to work those jobs. So why the fuck would I agree? Aside, let's put morals aside, right? On an economic standpoint, why the hell would I agree to deport all of these immigrants who are actually helping my economy, who are helping my pocket? It's like a trade-off, right? Like, okay, they're helping the economy and we allow them to stay. Like, what is the fucking problem? Why would I start all of this economic havoc? For what reason? Just because you morally don't like undocumented immigrants? Sagar, if you hate it, I would love to watch you go work in a field for a day. I know your pretty boy ass would not last an hour in a fucking field. Please. I don't know how Crystal deals with him. I really don't get it.
It would be bad
probably not.
For families who are trying to buy Tyson food
I
in
agree.
Costco.
Yes, it's true. Yeah, the price will go up. Let's be very real here.
Huge,
I believe
massively.
the price will probably go up. We'll be a more cohesive society. Will we have better supply and demand and better wages? Yeah, I believe that.
Listen.
So sometimes we just have to sit here.
A more cohesive society. He said, but would we be a more cohesive society? What the fuck does that even mean? See, that's just flat out racism, because I don't really understand what he means by a more cohesive society or a bit more society that has citizenship. I mean, like, you fucking idiot. Crystal could literally be without a citizenship. There's people who don't have citizenship who talk, walk, act, pay taxes, work, go to university. You wouldn't even know they don't have citizenship. What does not having a cohesive, society even mean? That's just so rude.
Here and lay out the full truth. And also, I believe the full thing should be laid out to the American people. Like I said on the China issue.
Yeah.
If you ask them, are you willing to pay higher prices and your stuff doesn't come from China? Most people say yes. There's a lot of polling on this. So on the same thing, it's like, well, what do you want? What do you want? What country do you want to live in?
So
we can live in all low prices.
The cohesive society thing, I just want to put to the side, because I think that's, first of all, I just wildly disagree. Actually, the poll numbers support the fact that you don't have, actually, racial divides have never been less in terms of political partisan identities than at any time, in our lives. But so I want to put the cohesive society part to the side, because I think that is very fraught and also very subjective. But, we really disagree about the economics of this.
Sure.
First of all, the typical view of just supply and demand of workers, and so, if you increase the supply, it's going to create lower wages. It's not that there's nothing to that, but the real picture is much more complicated than that, because, if you think about, for example, you now have deported or in the process of deporting 50% of all farm workers. All right, well, that's going to have huge economic implications for those farmers. It's going to have huge economic implications for the consumers. It's not really likely to increase wages, because why? Because workers don't really have enough power in the country to be able to claim their share of the, economic pie. So that's why I always think it's a red herring to focus on immigration as the sole. And I'm not saying this necessarily about you, Sagar, because you do embrace unionism and other things. But most politicians on the right embrace reducing immigration as the sole path to increasing wages, when they have no other demonstrated interest in raising wages in any other policy area. If you look throughout history, most consistently, the thing that has increased wages has been worker power. If you look at the charts, if you look at, when unions started to decline and workers started to have less power, and then the New Deal coalition starts to fall apart, that's when you see wages decline. And it's not up and down with regard to what...
Actually, someone in the chat made a great fucking point. He wants to talk about China. If you deport those immigrants, the U.S. might as well forget about competing with China. There's going to be no competition with China if we can't even get people to do these hard labor jobs. That's so freaking true. How do you compete with China when your own labor force is going to go kaput? You're going to literally have to depend more on China and outside countries like Mexico for your produce. That's such a great point. You're absolutely right.
What the immigration levels happen to be at that point. So if the actual concern is wages, I'm not going to deny that levels of immigration have an impact there. I think that would be, dishonest. Although, again, I think it's much more complicated. And if you look at the studies, they would suggest it's much more complicated. But the real thing you would want to do is increase worker power, so that they can claim their share of the record-breaking corporate profits that we've seen. So, to take up your example with China trade, which I'm also sympathetic to that, to that direction as well. For me there, you have a real, which was demonstrated during the pandemic, you have a real problem in this country, which is that we have outsourced so much that we are really vulnerable. And, it's a problem for consumers. We saw when the pandemic hit and you couldn't get things and there were shortages and prices escalated, et cetera. But even more to the point, we weren't making our own face masks. Like our industrial capacity has been so stripped that it really creates a national vulnerability. And I don't see a better way to deal with that than, some of the nearshoring and friendshoring and, reshoring and some of the programs, the industrial policy that's being engaged in under Joe Biden, which does have the potential to somewhat increase prices. Here, if your concern is wages, I see way better ways to go about this that aren't, cruel and don't require massive expansion of the deep state and are much less costly and are ultimately, and don't massively, create potential hyperinflation in food prices and meat prices and housing prices, et cetera. So to me, the solution of, let's just shut down immigration, it doesn't make sense for that to be the solution if the problem you're trying to solve is wages.
I think it's a yes and. I mean, if you look at a lot of those times, there are also at times where we had historically low levels of immigration, or it's what type of country do you live in at that time. So it's very unfair to compare high levels of immigration combined with a mass industrial economy. We have 6 to 8 million people who have arrived in this country in the last 4 years who we are lucky if they are literate in Spanish, let alone English. Don't speak any English in a society which is rapidly deindustrializing and going towards a service-based economy and knowledge-based economy. It just doesn't work. It's one of those where then there is a huge amount of competition in the lower wage and lower skilled sector. So
competition where? To go pick fruits off of a field? Or go work construction in 106 degrees during the summer? I'm sorry, if you've ever worked in a fucking restaurant, you literally won't get by with the cooks and the washers and shit if you don't speak Spanish. I was a server for 4 years. I would know. I literally had to learn food in Spanish so that I could communicate with people, and I was totally okay with it. But I, as a girl that was born in America and raised in America, had to conform to learning Spanish in order to communicate with people. So what makes you think that you have to know English when you immigrate to America? Most of these labor-intensive, low-paying jobs are taken up by immigrants, and they sometimes speak the same language, and that's okay. Like, the restaurant service is well known for speaking Spanish. Most servers know how to speak basic, Spanish when it comes to food and stuff like that. So, no, this idea that, they're barely literate in Spanish, if you're lucky, that's not a fucking issue. If you're working a labor-intensive job that's low-paying, you're more than likely going to have colleagues that also speak Spanish as well. And also, he's talking about there's competition in the low-paying job. Honey, there isn't. There's actually a shortage in people who work in labor-intensive jobs because after COVID, nobody wanted to go back to serving and shit. So, I mean, I don't think cooking has to be a low skill in general. I think cooking it takes a lot of skill to be a cook, right? Because there's a science that goes with cooking. But I'm talking about the context of the jobs that immigrants tend to work within. And I'm not just talking about like immigrants who are coming from South America or Central America. I'm talking about just immigrants in general, right? Like immigrants, like I have worked in an array of different kinds of restaurants, and in almost every single restaurant, in order for me to communicate with some of the people who worked in the restaurant, I would have to speak Spanish. So he's coming into this argument and he's saying these people are barely literate in English and they're creating competition in the labor force. It's actually untrue. Most of the time we would have to learn Spanish. But, Sagar is one of those types of dude that has probably never worked a labor-intensive job in his life. He's never worked a minimum wage job in his life. So he genuinely just doesn't know. Like, he's making up all of these assumptions because he's never been in that scenario. And that's the problem with a lot of these conservative or fiscally conservative, commentators. They have never once struggled a day in their life. They come from privileged families. They have all these assumptions about, workforce and speaking Spanish and different environments, and they just make up all of their assumptions based off of the privilege that they were able to live and grow up in, right? It's a problem.
Not only that, billions of dollars being thrown at, so basically, allowing these people to live here rent-free in charity-wise, I mean, you can look it up. Unless they have a work permit, they literally have to live on charity, which is
right, which is why they should have work permits.
But why should they have work permits? You arrive here
so
illegally.
That they can,
it's bullshit. I mean, they're coming here from countries. By the way, El Salvador just solved all of its crime problems. Do you know what the crime rate in El Salvador is now? It's lower than like Manhattan. So you can go back. You don't have to fear for your life anymore. Honduras is building a 10,000 person prison to implement the exact same thing. This whole idea that these countries can't solve their own problems, which they are now solving, is BS.
Okay.
Like this TPS status for people who've been living here.
But again,
this is that privileged ass take. To assume that people that can just go back to their country because they built a 10,000 person prison is preposterous. Absolutely preposterous.
Again,
25, 30 years, it's outrageous.
But again, so you view migrants as a net negative. I don't view migrants as a net negative whatsoever.
It depends on the migrant. It depends on who you are.
But hold on a second. We have a looming demographic issue in this country, as do all developed nations, of an aging population and a dwindling workforce-aged population. And the native-born population is, you're the first to point out, birth rates are low, right? We don't have a replacement rate. Places, I've lived in places in the country that have seen the population dwindle and go away. Those places are in crisis. Like, we need workers. We need workers. So, the idea that they're just a burden and a drain, well, a core part of the problem is the fact that, they do need work permits. They need to be able to work not in the shadows, so they're not exploited, which does have larger impacts than on the low-wage workforce, because if you can get an undocumented worker who's being paid under the table and not going to take you to OSHA if you're violating labor laws, et cetera, that's a much larger issue. So listen,
also, not to mention, when you're not giving immigrants work permits, they're working under the table, right? So they're getting cash for whatever they're doing. Aside from, like Crystal said, OSHA violations that may be happening, those workers also aren't paying taxes. Like, they're not really entrenched in the economy the way that you and I are, the way that you and I, we submit our taxes, we do all of our paperwork, we pay our dues, in a sense, to be able to live in the area that we live in and whatever. So, if you are really a Republican and you believe in taxes, you believe in people paying their dues, I genuinely don't understand why you would be against someone having a work permit, because if someone is working legally, they pay taxes. And if you don't want to file your taxes, then the IRS is going to come at you at some point. I don't know what to say about that. But at the end of the day, if you do have people under a work permit, it's actually going to be a lot more beneficial than, let me do X, Y, and Z. I want to deport all undocumented people. They're working under the table. That's a problem. They shouldn't get a work permit. Well, you're an idiot. Some undocumented folks still have to pay taxes. Yes. So people who are under the DACA program, for example, they get Social Security. But that's what I'm talking about, right? Giving people work permits doesn't necessarily mean that you get papers for documentation. So, for example, people who are under DACA, yes, they pay taxes just like everyone else because they get Social Security numbers, they get work permits, but they're not like they don't have green cards or whatever. Some of them don't, whatever the situation might be. Like, they might not be documented per se. That's the argument, right? Is that, okay, you gave people on, like, DACA has been a widely successful program. People are paying taxes for the most part. They're getting really highly educated. They're actually giving in to the American economy, but you want to sit here and say, oh, undocumented immigrants shouldn't get X, shouldn't get Y, shouldn't get Z. No, undocumented immigrants should actually get work permits because it's been proven through the DACA program that it's widely successful and they do give to our economy the same way that documented people do.
I am personally, I don't know if I'm quite ready to go where Ryan is with the full open borders, because
I do think... Is he a full open border guy?
Yeah, he's an open border guy.
Okay.
Which I respect, but, I do have questions about, okay, well, if you just did open borders, like, how many people are we talking about? And how many can you really, deal with? There is a limit, I think, to the capacity at one given time. But significantly increasing the legal pathways to citizenship here, I am wildly in favor of. I think it would be good for the country, obviously be good for those migrants, but more importantly, I think it'd be good for the country. I think it would be good overall for workers. I think it has to be paired with a stronger labor movement, which we're already seeing come into fruition. But, just to talk about the last few months, like, we have had very high levels of migration, as you would point out, over the past few months. And we also have had wages for the first time in quite a while that have risen at a faster pace than inflation. So if migration was just the like blanket disaster for workers, and that was the reason to deport everybody and, you know, lock the gates, et cetera, that hasn't been the experience of our economy just over the past, you know, year, several months.
Look, it's a 25-year issue. This is not, you know, we can't put 3 months of data and say that's indicative of everything. By the way, if the Biden administration, I call on the Biden administration to release the true economic number, how much we have spent on these people. Get on an airplane these days. I'm flying from Phoenix. Half the guys on the plane are illegal, getting paid with taxpayer citizens with their little packets, flying to Washington, D.C. because they get free whatever, shelter.
They don't want to be charity case. They want to work. They want to work. They want to earn money. They want to pay taxes. Most of them do pay taxes, by the way, too.
You are welcome to work in the country that you're born in. You know, otherwise you can apply for a quote-unquote pathway to citizenship.
These aren't like people who want to be welfare moochers.
But they are.
Want to work. They want to contribute. They do pay taxes overwhelmingly.
I do not begrudge them for wanting to work here. Everybody wants to work here. Over 1 billion people who've been polled over in the world say they want to move to the United States. But that's why I would say to Ryan, that's insane. You can't allow 1 billion people to move here, and nor should we. The demographic argument is a different one, and that's one where, again, we should be able to choose who gets to come here and or not, and what type of society and people that we want to allow into our economy and thus become future citizens. That is something that should be decided by democracy.
What kind of society and people should come to America? Oh my God. This is so bad. Sagar is basically a supremacist, honestly.
Not based on whether you can walk across Mexico and pay a drug smuggler to enter the United States illegally.
Again,
why are they better off than somebody from Africa?
All right, so
it's not fair.
Let's bring in more people.
Why are you assuming that someone who's paying a smuggler to come to America is better off than someone from Africa? Why can't they both be struggling the same way? I don't get it. I don't understand that argument. I know African immigrants that have came here that have struggled heavily. And also, you know, Sagar wants to talk about, oh, they're taking up half the plane. These illegals are taking up half the plane. Okay, babes, why don't you talk about the hundreds and thousands of undocumented Ukrainian immigrants that came here and sucked up all of our benefits? They got health insurance, they got Social Security, they got work permits. They actually got things that even Americans themselves don't get. Housing help, vouchers, stuff like that. So if you want to talk about illegal immigrants doing da-da-da-da-da, you better talk about Ukrainians. Because, honey, the way we spent so much of our resources on Ukrainian refugees and these Republicans are moot about it is wild. Actually wild. Every single undocumented immigrant should have been treated like the Ukrainians. But unfortunately, since they're not white, they don't get treated that way.
People from Africa.
But that's what I'm saying.
I'm down for
well,
that.
actually,
Let's be, but
funnily
you know,
enough, lots of Africans are now flying to Mexico.
There you go. So it's more egalitarian. You should be happy.
That's not egalitarian.
Listen, the reality is that in terms of migration, if you look not just now but historically, like people typically want to go to countries that are nearby. In fact, there's far more migration between different South American countries than there are South American migrants coming here, because there's more cultural affinity, you're more likely to have family ties, et cetera. And so, you know, it's not just the fact that you happen to be able to walk there, it's also that you're more likely to want to move to a place that is closer. But, you know, the bottom line for me also is just when I look at the immigrants that I know in my life, when I look at the contributions of immigrants across society, I think we would be so foolish to not embrace the contribution of a group of people who, just by nature, like, it is not an easy thing to pick up your whole life and move somewhere and try to make it. And, you know, that, like, they are in a lot of ways, I know this sounds hokey, but I really feel this. They are in a lot of ways like the embodiment of the American dream. And to shut your doors to that, to, like, you know, kick out people who've been here 10 and 20 years, who have families, who are deeply enmeshed in society, who are contributing members of their communities, I don't just think it's wrong morally. I think it would be so catastrophic in terms of the economics and politics of society that, again, even Trump didn't contemplate such a draconian move in his first term and wouldn't contemplate such a draconian move because he relied on undocumented immigrants in his own businesses. So this is a man who is acquainted with the realities.
He takes advantage of the system.
Of what needs to occur.
Yeah,
you're right. The way
Crystal,
our economy actually works.
I support a law called E-Verify, which would require Donald Trump and all employers to verify that their employees are not illegal immigrants. Problem solved.
I support
Easy.
that. Plus a much larger legal, if you have a much higher level of legal migration where there is an actual pathway to citizenship, you're gonna have much less chaos at the border. you can then have more enforcement, right? There's a path here that, there's a way to do this and you're not doing it the right way. As of now, you just have, it's completely broken down. For people coming from most countries, there is no pathway to citizenship. We all know the asylum process is completely broken. And so, that's how you end up with Americans looking at it and saying like, we got to do something here.
Okay, we'll agree to disagree. Not going to solve it here as usual. The immigration section goes on for too long.
It will continue.
And the producers are, maybe Trump will win and we'll get to find out. All right, that could be an interesting possibility. Hey, if you like that video.
Thoughts on that video, on that debate? I genuinely think that it was a solid debate. Sagar surprisingly didn't piss me off as much as he did last time, which is surprising because that man, I usually cannot stand him. Once again, I think Crystal did an amazing job at keeping the discourse and keeping her cool. I think she's just genuinely really good at doing that. And I've said this once, I'll say this again. I think discourse like that is really important within politics because people need to see both sides presented and they need to be able to make their own opinions based on educated people saying their opinions. Now, I'm not saying Sagar is necessarily educated, but, a lot of the things that he was saying was based off of his own biases, while Crystal was talking about like genuine numbers and how actually like economically and morally it's just not right to deport everyone. So, I thought it was a great video, and like always, make sure you like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. We'll see you next time.